In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night.
Hello everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. Today I am going to be reviewing a movie that I've talked about at great length on the channel before, because it is one of my favorite movies ever. I think even one of my first videos on the channel, which was a Bloody Sunday video, I don't know if people still do that anymore, was on one of my favorite scenes in this movie, and that is of course Dracula's daughter. This movie came out in 1936. It was directed by Lambert Hillier, and it stars Gloria Holden, Edward Van Sloan, Otto Kruger, Margaret Churchill, Nan Gray, and it is based on a story by John R. Balderston. He did not write the script, but it's based on a story that he wrote for the film. And he was the guy who basically wrote the second version of the original Dracula play, which was originally done by Hamilton Dean, the version that most people know of now, and the version that Bela Lugosi and I believe Edward Van Sloan originated in the theater is best known as the Dean Balderston version. That play went on to become the Todd Browning film, so naturally I think it's a good thing that they got Balderston back on this film so that there is some sort of a through line between the two in terms of tone. This movie picks up right where the original movie left off, with Van Helsing having staked Count Dracula. Two cops come in and find him and are like, oh my god, you just killed this guy, and take him in under murder charges. So there's a trial going on. He calls in one of his friends, a psychiatrist, to try and help him, so that his psychiatrist friend Jeffrey Garth and him are both in London. At the same time, Countess Zaleska, who is Dracula's daughter, has arrived in London. She steals Dracula's body and burns it, and tries to release herself from the curse, but she finds herself returning to her vampiric tendencies, so she starts sort of socializing with people in London and happens upon the psychiatrist, Jeffrey Garth, and tries to get him to help her break the curse without ever actually telling him that she is a vampire. So all of these different stories kind of come to a head. Music-wise, this has music, unlike Dracula, which, unless you're watching it with Philip Glass, has no score, except in like one scene where some of the characters are at an orchestra, and that's just kind of in-film, in-scene music, and then we get a little bit of Swan Lake at the very beginning of the film. In this, we actually have an actual throughout the film score. It is very much the typical 30s going into 40s horror fare that you would get, but it is a really good score. It has these recurring motifs for characters like Countess Zaleska, aka Dracula's daughter, that I think work really, really well. It's not on the level of something like the Bride of Frankenstein score, because what is, but I do like it more than the soundtrack for things like The Wolfman, just because I think it is less recycled than that score was, because that score was heavily recycled in just about every other Universal monster movie to come out in the 1940s, just because they were making so many of them so cheaply. You hear those same stings over and over and over. They never did that with the Dracula's daughter score, so it really stands on its own, much like the Bride of Frankenstein score, as its own thing. Not on the same level, but really, really good. And there is, again, use of in-scene music in this film, in the case of the scene where Countess Zaleska is playing the piano and is basically having this back and forth argument with Sander, her servant. Basically, she's saying that now that Count Dracula is gone and dead. She's actually burned his body. She is now free. He's like, you're a vampire for life. You'll never be free. And they keep doing this back and forth. And she's trying to play this happy music that speaks of release. And as she gets more and more intense, the music gets a lot more dissonant and twisted. And he's like, does that music speak of release? And she's like, no. And she just resigns herself and mopes a little bit and then goes out to kill somebody. I think that was a great use of in-scene playing of music to express the emotions of the character, and that's a trick that gets pulled in later gothic horror films of this style, Universal and otherwise, but never quite in the same way. There's a scene like this in, I think, Return of Dracula and one in House of Frankenstein. In Return of Dracula, it is Bela Lugosi basically hypnotizing this one character as she's playing piano. In House of Frankenstein, it is John Carradine as Baron Latos, the Dracula character in that movie, hypnotizing another character, but it doesn't have the same dynamic. It's always this hypnotizing force, basically bringing this person over to the dark side. In this case, it is the music saying that she can never leave the dark side because she's been there for so long anyway, which I thought was cool. Again, the story picks up right where the original left off, and I really, really like it. It's kind of like Bride of Frankenstein in that respect, except there was no last-minute tacked on happy ending, like with Bride of Frankenstein, where James Whale was like, no, this never actually happened, actually, and there's no, prologue with Mary Shelley. You could take Dracula and then Dracula's daughter and watch them back to back, and they would be in perfect continuity. There is no break, even though it was years later. Having Van Helsing, or Von Helsing as they call him in the movie, I'll get to that, on trial is, I think, a stroke of genius, because he gets to be the big hero in the original, but if you are found having driven a stake through somebody's heart in modern London, people are gonna freak out, and it's kind of this wake-up call, because even if Jonathan and Mina and Dr. Seward at that point believe in vampires, the rest of London doesn't, so making that a big plot point and a reason to bring new characters into the story, I think, was a stroke of genius. That said, they don't really conclude that story in a great way, which I will get to in the spoilers. Dialogue in the movie is decent. There are some lines that I think are derivative, which I will get to, but they take some older lines, specifically Lugosi's classic line in the original, the "I never drink wine," and they give that to Countess Zaleska in the movie, but it doesn't feel shoehorned in. It feels natural, because she's not hamming it up as Countess Zaleska. It just feels like part of this casual conversation she's having at this party, but it's a nice nod to the original, and it doesn't feel forced, particularly in her reading of the lines. And it brings back one of the quotes that I believe is from Shakespeare that I've mentioned before that gets brought back in like every monster movie, which is, "There are more things in heaven than earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy," except in this movie it's, "There are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in your psychiatry," when she's talking to Jeffrey the psychiatrist and giving a little playful nod to the fact that there's definitely more going on than he thinks, because he's kind of scoffing at vampires in that scene. My favorite element of the story is Zaleska trying to beat back her vampiric cravings and being a reluctant vampire, which I will get more into when I talk about Gloria Holding's performance, but the fact that she actually goes to a psychiatrist to get help about it is not something I think a lot of people would have thought of or expected to see in a vampire movie. She goes to the psychiatrist and is really crafty about it, because she never mentions that she's a vampire. She just mentions that she's struggling with these urges that she can't control, and he basically tells her to meet it and fight it and compares it to alcoholism. I feel like a lot of people weren't reading that kind of thing into vampire movies at the time, and there's a lot of different kinds of subtext in this movie. There's definitely some sexuality, which has always been a part of the vampire thing, or at least has been for a very long time, but there's also this feeling of addiction on the part of Zaleska that she's trying to fight but can't control. I mean, even in Horror of Dracula, Peter Cushing straight up compares vampirism to addiction to drugs. And vampirism as an addiction metaphor definitely happens later, but it started, as far as I can tell, with this movie. I think it was very ahead of its time in its portrayal of vampirism in a lot of ways. And at the beginning of the movie, the cops who arrest Von Helsing and who we see a little later in the movie, they're decent comic relief. They kind of feel like the characters that, had this been a horror comedy, probably would have been played by Abbott and Costello, but this is again a British horror film, or at least is set in Britain, so they're very much sort of English eccentric type characters, and I don't find them particularly funny, but they are mildly entertaining, and I enjoy watching them. Edward Van Sloan reprises his role as Professor Van Helsing in this movie, but they call him Von Helsing for literally no good reason. They just switch out one of the letters, even though he was called Van Helsing in the original movie. Why do they do that? It is the one little continuity thing that pisses me off so much. Why is that a thing? Other than that, he is acting just as well as he did in the original. I think his lines are a little bit derivative of the original and kind of a step down in that respect. He's kind of reiterating a lot of the same things he does in the original, like the strength of the vampire is that people will not believe in him, or that he is unbelievable, reiterating all the details of the vampire legend to just to different people, which he has to do because, again, Jonathan and Mina and Dr. Seward are all out of the picture in this, so he has to convince a whole new cast of characters that vampires are real. But it feels like he's rehashing a lot of the same dialogue from the original movie. He's delivering it just as well, but it's not really as impactful the second time around, and it just feels like a retread, even if it was, on some level, necessary. And of course, Gloria Holden as Countess Zaleska absolutely carries this movie. She was actually really reluctant to play this role, or to be in a horror movie at all, and I think that helps her performance. Countess Zaleska does not want to be a vampire at all. She is not played as a dramatic, over-the-top villain in the Karloff or Lugosi vein. She is a really sympathetic human character. This really earnest performance, but also this sort of detachment and reluctance that she has, is perfect, I think. As I think I've said before, this is, to my knowledge, one of the first reluctant vampires on film. You have characters like Mina in the original, who's kind of dueling with her newly found vampire nature, but she is a victim of Count Dracula. I guess Countess Zaleska technically is too, but the Count is out of the picture at this point, and she is kind of technically this movie's villain, but I like that there are no real villains in this movie. Every character is multifaceted. It is one of the Universal monster movies that I think has the most three-dimensional characters to it, and it is up there with Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein in that regard, I think, and even Bride of Frankenstein has sort of delightful hammy villains in characters like Dr. Pretorius. There is nothing like that in this movie. Every character has good and bad aspects. That said, when Gloria Holden chooses to be sinister, it is that more powerful because we kind of can sympathize with her a little bit, so when she feels completely lost and hopeless and goes to this really dark place, it is a lot more chilling. It's not scary, but I'm not scared by most horror movies I've seen, and I never go to horror movies to be scared. I just think it's a really good performance, and it is really impactful when she is doing dark and nefarious things because you know why she's doing them. And then we have, I guess, her sort of Renfield character, her servant, Sander. And he's the most depressing character on the planet. He, as I said, is constantly reminding Zaleska of her vampire nature, and he's almost an annoyance to her in that regard. But you can tell that he kind of has some anger towards her because he wants to be immortal, and it kind of seems a lot of times like Countess Zaleska barely notices him, so he's got a little bit of hostility towards her and is kind of taking it out on her. But regardless, he's a really sort of matter-of-fact character. He says whatever the hell's on his mind. Because of that, he tends to be really unintentionally funny. In the scene I mentioned before in particular, where Countess Zaleska is playing the piano and trying to remember all these happy things, and he'll always interject with some way of making that thing dark and miserable, and she'll be like, "Shut up! I'm trying to be happy right now. And we have a really good leading man and lady in a very sort of traditional Hollywood way in Otto Kruger as Jeffrey Garth and Margaret Churchill as his assistant Janet, who are constantly sort of sparring with each other and fighting, but you can tell that they're very clearly in love with each other. And they're both solid, sort of clean-cut, classic leading man and lady characters for the more dramatic characters like Van Helsing and Countess Zaleska to sort of play off of, but they do have a lot of good character to them themselves, and they play really well off of each other comedically. There are these recurring moments where Jeffrey does not know how to tie his own tie, and so has to rely on Janet, and she keeps trying to resign, and he keeps bringing her back because he can't tie his own tie, and sometimes she'll tie it perfectly just to sort of spite him, and sometimes she'll tie it crookedly and not tell him, and she just likes to sort of get under his skin in that way. She also prank calls him at one point, which is really fun, because then when he gets an actual important call later, he thinks it's another prank call and insults one of the doctors at St. Mary's Hospital, and it's actually hilarious. We also have some other great minor characters. There is one eccentric character who we meet at these parties that Jeffrey goes to. He's just this really uppity British character who appears a couple times, and he's just really over the top in a way that I find hilarious. If you've seen the movie, he's the character who talks to Jeffrey on the phone when he's looking for Janet near the end of the film, and he's just like, I told her, what's it all about? Have you found a better party? I cannot do him justice at all. He's just really dramatic and totally oblivious to everything that's happening, and I just find him really, really funny. And then we have my favorite minor character in the movie, which is Lily, as played by Nan Gray. She's kind of this really quiet, reserved young woman who has this run-in with Countess Zaleska. For reasons that I'll get into, she kind of has to play the same scene twice in a way that I think is really cool. I think her acting is fantastic. I'm also a little biased for reasons that you might know about. I wrote my own story where Lily is the main character, so I've kind of fleshed out that character in my own head and sort of projected some things onto it that makes me connect to that character more, but I do think Nan Gray does give a great performance in the movie regardless. Then we have Sir Basil Humphrey, who is another one of Professor Van Helsing's friends in the movie. I forget whether he's a medical professor or I think he's one of the legal officials in the movie. I forget what his actual status is, but he's one of Von Helsing's friends who helps him on his exploits, and his constant reluctance to believe the vampire stuff is played in a way that I find especially funny. One of the highlights is near the end of the movie where he's talking to his butler. He gets a call from Jeffrey to go with him and Van Helsing to look for vampires, basically, and he just goes off at his butler for no reason. Get my heavy top coat, I'm going out after vampires. And it's just like, vampires, and he just goes, vampires, ha, ha, ha. And it's just so over the top in the best way, and there is a lot of humor in this movie that's you wouldn't expect from such a tragic three-dimensional horror movie, but they managed to balance this melancholy and really depressing story with a lot of humor in a way that shouldn't work but does. I think the gothic atmosphere in this movie is even better than it is in the original. We've got a lot of great sets and some fog-shrouded atmosphere in the original, but it's a lot more polished the way they do it in this one. Better and much more intentional use of sort of film noir slash expressionist lighting. The way they sort of paint with shadows is a lot more artistically done and a lot more beautiful in this movie. Something about the way they use the fog in this feels much more haunting than in the original. Maybe they just used more fog, I'm not sure. I loved the fog in the original, but something about the fog in this movie works in a way that it doesn't in the original. I'm really not sure what that's about, but maybe this one is just more stylishly filmed in general, which helps. The costumes are also on par with, if not better than, in the original for me, especially in the case of characters like Countess Zaleska and of characters like Janet. They have some of the most beautiful costumes I've seen in a lot of the Universal Monsters movies. Again, Bride of Frankenstein is kind of top tier Universal. I think that movie has the best costuming of any of the Universal Monster movies, but I think this movie is probably right behind it for me. The sets are also more lavish. We've got the flats of the different characters, and in particular Zaleska's flat, because she as a character is a painter, which is a plot point. She paints these really eerie, morbid paintings that we get to see on her walls. They're never really talked about in depth, but they're really, really beautiful, and I like looking at those background details in the scenes. They also recreate the Transylvania that we see in the original film for reasons that I will get into in spoilers, and they recreate the shot of Count Dracula emerging from his coffin, but they do it with Countess Zaleska. They recreate the village and the castle, and we even get to see parts of the castle that we didn't see before. This new castle and village set is really beautiful. Again, in some ways, it's a bit more polished than it was in the original, so in some ways I like it a little bit more. I mean, right down to the staircase with the cobweb over it. It's done in a way that feels a little bit more polished, and it might be kind of sacrilegious, but I think I like it a little bit more. That is really all I have to say on the movie that isn't spoilery, so before I get into spoilers, I think this is one of the best Universal Monster movies ever made. It is slightly above the original Dracula, just for me personally, I think. Sometimes they flip-flop, and the original is my favorite. I think it is hard to top Bela Lugosi and Dwight Frye as performers, but we do get Edward Van Sloan back, and we get great performances from a new cast of people. We get one of the most truly sympathetic, tragic horror stories that Universal has ever made, with a lot of comedy injected into it in a way that doesn't feel forced. That kind of tone is really only rivaled by Bride of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man. If you've not seen this movie, I implore you to do so. Again, I think it's one of the best Universal Monster movies, right up there with Bride of Frankenstein and The Invisible Man. That is my spoiler-free review of Dracula's Daughter. Here are the spoilers. So, as I mentioned, one of my favorite characters in the movie, one of my favorite minor characters in the movie is Lily, as played by Nan Gray, and the entire Lily sequence in the film is a masterpiece in my eyes. Zaleska has been told by Jeffrey Garth that she needs to beat back her cravings the way an alcoholic would, by sort of testing herself, by, in a sense, sort of putting alcohol in front of herself and forcing herself not to drink it, and to sort of fight it in that way. So she gets together with Sandor, and they find this girl on the street who happens to be named Lily, and tell her that she needs to pose for a painting. It is this portrait of a woman's head and shoulders, and long story short, Zaleska can't fight back her cravings, and she ends up biting Lily. Not only is it just a really well done scene with a lot of tension that's built up, it is one of the first instances that I know of lesbian vampirism on screen. Carmilla was already a story that existed at this point, but it had not been adapted. There is this very sort of erotic undertone to the whole scene. Lily has to sort of undress to a point that is not at all comfortable for her. How this got past the censors in 1936, I'm not sure, but it was basically masked under the whole vampire aspect of the story. The whole lesbian vampire thing, as I think I've talked about with Carmilla, has definitely a little bit of a homophobic undertone to it, but in a lot of ways that has sort of been reclaimed and turned around by a lot of media now, and I think it isn't as damaging looked at through a modern lens now, especially because Gloria Holden's Countess Zaleska is such a sympathetic character. As I said, Nan Gray basically asks to act the same scene twice because her body is found later and she's brought into St. Mary's Hospital, and Jeffrey Garth has to sort of look at her and basically hypnotizes her and gets her to explain to him what happened, so she has to go through the motions of the scene while kind of giving some of her internal monologue in her head out loud to him, and she has to basically act the scene again while in the bed, pretending to be in a trance, and then she has to die at the very end of it. I think she gives a fantastic performance in that regard. I'm sure pretending to be hypnotized and running a scene that you had done before, again, cannot be easy, so major props to Nan Gray in this film. And then the finale of this movie is where Countess Zaleska has given up on losing her vampire nature, and she's just like, I'm gonna run away from the world, but I want to take you with me, Jeffrey. And he's like, no. And she's just like, fine, I'll take Janet instead. And so she takes Janet with her all the way to Transylvania, and they have to run back to Transylvania, and the villagers all freak out because they see light in the castle and they think Count Dracula's back, and it's great. And we almost get another attack from Countess Zaleska, this time on Janet, before Jeffrey somehow miraculously barges in, and he basically agrees to give himself up to her and stay with them forever. But Sander, who's been harboring this grudge against Countess Zaleska for so long, just straight up shoots her with a bow and arrow because she's been refusing to make him immortal. One of the other things I don't really understand is how vampirism actually works. Is he a half vampire? Was Renfield a half vampire? How do you become a half vampire or a whole vampire? It's never truly explained, but I don't really care. The movie ends on this really bleak note. Unlike the original, we don't really get to see the characters go away on their happily ever after. It ends with this shot of Countess Zaleska's now truly lifeless face, with, I think, Sir Basil saying she's beautiful. Von Helsing is like, she was this beautiful when she died over 100 years ago. And that's where the movie ends. That is kind of my problem with the movie, because the whole Von Helsing being on trial thing is never resolved in any way. But at the same time, the more I think about it, I kind of like that, because it is one of the more unhappy endings to a Universal film. Nobody really gets their happy ending. Janet and Jeffrey have been traumatized, and we don't really get to see their happily ever after. Von Helsing is probably still up for the death sentence as far as we know, and Countess Zaleska is dead, and Sander has been shot by somebody, so nobody gets a happy ending in this, and we don't get to see that a lot in Universal monster movies, so I liked that. That's all I gotta say in terms of spoilers. Again, one of the better Universal monster movies in my opinion. I love all the Universal monster movies, but this is top tier for me, so see it if you haven't. That is my review of Dracula's Daughter. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye.